Welcome. Today I'm going to show you guys how to play Deep Vents. I finally figured out how to play this game. It wasn't actually that hard. There were some abilities that took a little bit more time to understand than others, but for the most part, it's not that hard of a game. Now, in this game, we're going to try to each player is going to try to build an ecosystem, a hydrothermal ecosystem, and try to maintain it, because it's not so easy to do so, because after all, in the depths of the ocean, there are tons of deadly predators, and so these deadly predators are going to try to feed off of your opponent's hydrothermal ecosystem. So you can actually be kicked out from the game if you lose too much Archaean. Archaean in this game takes form in these cubes here. So this is Archaean in the game. And each player is going to start with a certain amount of Archaean. Now, if you're playing a two-player game, the first player is going to get 10 of these, while the second player is going to get 11 of these. Now, there are lots of predators in the deep ocean. So if a predator attacks you and causes you to lose some of these Archaean, then you're gonna run out and have less to purchase some of these tiles here. Another thing to note is if you lose all of this Archaean and then an attack hits you and you have no Archaean left to basically take the damage that you're supposed to receive, you're going to end up taking a special token here, which is going to minus your score at the end of the game. So you're going to take this little token here. So now it's going to give you 10 more Archaean. So you won't be completely out of Archaean if you take this, but you are going to have this deducted from your score at the end of the game if you still have it. So that's something to note. And you do not want to hold on to this. You can't just simply get a ton of these and then, just deduct all of them from your score at the end of the game. If you get 2 of these tokens here at the end of the game, or should I say, if you get 2 of these tokens here, then you're out of the game. So if you ever have 2 of these tokens, then you're out of the game, and if there are more than 2 players, then everybody continues to play without you. But if there's only 1 player remaining, then the game is over. So that's how that's going to work. So if you get 2 of these, so if you get 2 of these in a 2-player game, then obviously you're going to have minus 20 points at the end of the game, and you might not win. Probably not. Player 1 will probably win, or whoever survived will probably end up winning. So getting these is a bad thing. You'll want to, of course, try to pay them off, but in order to pay them off, you're going to have to pay 10 Archaea to do so. So that means from your supply, from your general supply, you're going to have to pay this Archaea to get rid of this, 10 of it. So obviously you're going to want to have a little bit more than 10 of these, if possible, to pay this off. So that is something that could happen for sure, because if you get 2 of these, you're out of the game. So you don't want to get even 1, obviously. So obviously trying to get more of these cubes is a must. Now some of these tiles here do that. Some of these tiles will give you extra Archaea. But you don't want to utilize too much Archaea in the beginning of the game, because in the beginning of the game, this is the only tile that you have, the Deep Vents tile, which everybody starts with, that's going to produce Archaea for you. So, for instance, there are 2 mechanisms for each tile that can activate. You can either activate the growth, or you can activate trigger. Now, trigger cannot be activated unless there's already Archaea on the tile anyways. Some trigger effects will not work if you do not have enough Archaea on a tile. There's like one, for instance, the Scaly Foot Snail requires you to have 4 Archaea on the tile in order to trigger its effect. Because when you trigger an effect, usually you have to pay Archaea from the exact same hex that you are going to, usually, from the exact same hex, to pay for the trigger ability. So usually you can't always activate trigger effects. The Vampire Squid here doesn't have a growth ability. This tile here, the Vampire Squid, does not have a growth ability. It has a passive growth. So if it's adjacent to a tile, like the Deep Vents here, every time the Deep Vents triggers effect happens, this tile is, since it's adjacent to Deep Vent, it's going to get one of those Archaean on the hex. So the only thing you can do with the Vampire Squid is to activate its trigger, and in order to activate its trigger, it has to have 2 Archaean on this tile in order to activate the trigger. So there might be some turns where you're not doing anything at all with the Vampire Squid, because it just depends on how many adjacent tiles are next to it that are triggering and then getting to add Archaean as a passive growth ability to this Vampire Squid before you're able to activate its trigger, to pay 2 Archaean to activate it. So you're going to definitely want to get more of these types of tiles, like the Black Smoker, the White Smoker, Porous Rock. You're going to want things that will definitely allow you to get the Archaean off of the hexes in order to add them to the supply. Now, to your general supply, because normally these hexes are going to produce Archaean, but some of these hexes, like especially pretty much all of the Predators, are not going to allow you to take the Archaean off and add them to your general supply. So even if you had tons of these cubes, tons and tons, and you decided not to activate the trigger abilities of the Vampire Squid, and you just had tons, yes, you're going to get some extra points at the end of the game for this, but you're not going to be able to add any of these from the Vampire Squid to your general supply. So you're definitely going to want to get some more of similar tiles similar to this, and obviously while still trying to get some Predators as well. So there's quite a few here. This one, the Isopod Swarm, it has no growth ability. So you can't activate its growth ability because it has none. It doesn't work. It has no effect. So it just has no effect. Now, the only way it's a passive growth ability works is if an opponent's tile is decimated. There are some tiles in here that will decimate tiles. The Undersea Volcano will decimate itself and then decimate all of your opponent's tiles. Well, one of their choice anyways. And so when that happens, the player who has the Isopod Swarm would then be able to put 5 Archaea from the supply, not your supply, from the supply from the box here, and add 5 to the Isopod Swarm. Then it could activate its trigger ability, paying 1 Archaea from there, and then it would get the other 4 Archaea to the person's general supply, and then it would also get a shell as well. So there are these shells. Now, shells will be worth some points at the end of the game, but only 1 point for every 2 shells you have, rounding up. So if you only have 1 shell, you only get 1 point. If you have 2 shells, you only get 1 point. So that's how that's going to work. So you're probably thinking, well, what good are shells? Well, shells are very useful. There are some types of attacks out there that will cause you to lose tons of Archaea. I know one in particular will cause some players to lose 5 Archaea, maybe more. And so if you have a shell, you can use the shell to block the damage, and instead of losing 5 Archaea, you could lose only maybe 2 Archaea, because the shell is going to save half the damage. So half of the damage will be halved if you pay a shell in the process. So if the damage was 5, well, rounding up, what would half be? Well, you would receive only 2 damage, which means you would lose 2 Archaea from your personal supply. Not from any of the hexes, but from your personal supply when you get attacked. So you don't want to get attacked, and you sure definitely want to have some shells for sure if your opponent attacks you quite a bit. Especially if they manage to an attack that causes you to lose 10 Archaea, you're going to want a shell to take off half that damage. Instead of spending 10 Archaea, 5 is a whole lot better than 10, right? Now, you can only use one shell per attack, per trigger attack. So, if you had 5 shells, you couldn't use a whole bunch of shells per that attack to block all the damage. That's not allowed. You can only do one shell per trigger. Now, if, like for instance, the vampire squid here, let's say the vampire squid had 4 Archaea on it, and your opponent decided to activate its trigger twice because he could, because he has 4 Archaea here, he could pay 2 to attack you to trigger his effect. Then he could trigger again by paying 2 more Archaea from the same tile, and that would be 2 separate attacks, because it would be 2 separate triggers. Then you could use the shell for the first trigger, and if you had another shell, you could use the second shell for the second trigger. But using shells for a vampire squid's attack isn't very useful, because you're only going to lose 1 Archaea per attack from the vampire squid. So the vampire squid has a very weak attack, if I do say so myself. It doesn't have an extremely powerful attack. But there are some that could be quite hazardous, especially if, for instance, an opponent has lots of bioluminescence. So this is the anglerfish, and it's going to do damage, a lot of damage to your opponents if they have a lot of this symbol, which is bioluminescence. So if I had, let's say this is the vampire squid, this is the deep vent here, this is the giant squid over here, for instance. This one has a bioluminescence tag. So does the giant squid here. And so does the deep vent here. If the opponent, for instance, over here, had 3 Archaea on the anglerfish, because that's how much it would need to trigger its attack, it would need to have 3 Archaea on it. It could attack me here and every other opponent, if you're playing with more than 2 players, and they would lose 1 Archaea for every bioluminescence tag they have. And so in this case, this player here would lose 3 Archaea because of that. So obviously, there are a lot stronger attacks out there, and if I had more tiles, because there's 8 rounds in this game, so at the end of the game, you're probably going to have about 9 tiles altogether in your ecosystem, so it's quite possible you could have more than 3 bioluminescent tags. That means the anglerfish could do even more damage than that. So that's basically what that means. So obviously you don't want to get attacked because you do not want to run out of these, but you also want to try to mount a defense by trying to get some shells to protect yourself, because in this game, you know, the bigger fish always eats the smaller fish. That's how it works in the depths of the ocean. And so pretty much everything alive is a predator down in the depths of the ocean. So this is a game that you will definitely be getting attacked quite a bit. Now you could only focus on defense and not try to get any tiles that attack, but the chances of that are still slim. You're still going to get some tiles that trigger attacks. It's kind of almost impossible to avoid. Now, why is that the case? Well, because everybody is going to get a tile at the beginning of each of their turns. So yes, everybody starts with the deep vents tile, but every turn, every player's turn, they're going to get 1 tile of their choice, okay? Or depending on how much they're willing to lose to get it. Now here we have the goblin shark, giant tube worms, isopod swarm, giant oarfish, giant squid, and we even have the vampire squid over here as well, access to that as well. So let's say player 1, this is player 1 here, they want to get that vampire squid for their turn. They would have to pay 1 Archaea here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, and then they would get to take the vampire squid from the top of that pile. That's a lot of Archaea. I wouldn't recommend doing that very often. Try to spend as little Archaea as possible. You do not want to run out of Archaea. So that would be probably a bad move. If you really wanted that vampire squid, though, maybe it would be worth it. But it is a big risk doing that. But let's just say, for instance, I just wanted the giant tube worms. I would still have to pay 1 Archaea to the goblin shark to take this tile. And then at the end of my turn, you would just move these to the left and then add, obviously, the next one from the top of the pile to here. That's how that would work. But that would happen at the end of your turn, and simply getting a tile is only the first part of your turn. So there's still a lot that's going to happen, and it's going to be quite a bit of stuff that's going to happen, especially towards mid-game to end of the game. So let me put these back like so. There we go. Okay. So that's better like that. Okay, so these are mine. I don't want to mix them up with Mantis over there. Once again, Mantis not exactly thrilled that he wasn't included in this game. Manta Ray and all that, you know. They live pretty far down there. Maybe not all the way to the bottom, but, you know, he was kind of upset that he wasn't in the game. But anyways, if you take this one here, the Goblin Shark, the first one is always free. So you don't have to put any Archaea on a tile if it's the first one and it's the first one that you're taking. So that's something to note. You don't have to waste Archaea in order to get a tile. But that does limit your options to whatever happens to be the first tile that you want to get. And each one of these have so many different abilities to choose from. You might have a particular strategy in mind. Okay, now, in the next video, let's continue on, actually. There's one more thing I want to mention. So, let's say I chose the Goblin Shark. The Goblin Shark, okay? Let's say the Goblin Shark, I decided to put the Goblin Shark here. This is my first turn. My first turn was to take the Goblin Shark. And you try to keep it like this. Now, two things will either happen, either growth or trigger. And you can choose which one you're going to do for each tile. But if you can't activate a trigger, then there's growth. You're going to have to activate growth. But some, of course, can't activate even with growth, like that vampire squid. So then just nothing happens, obviously. So this is what you would do. The top leftmost tile would activate first. So right now, Deep Vent is the top left. And then in the same row, if there was a tile here, that one would activate, and then this one would activate because it's the next row down, and it's the leftmost tile. So right now, on this first turn, I would activate this, then this. Now let's say I had this one on my second turn. Okay? Now I would activate this, this, and then this. So that can change. Of course, if you keep adding tiles to different spots, then it'll be like this activating first, then this, then this, then this. So there are some choices of locations of where you can put these for sure, and that could be advantageous, of course, to do so. Now, let's just say I had these two particular tiles. Okay? Let's just say, actually, let's add the vampire squid to the equation here. Okay? Let's just say that was how it looked. That's exactly how it looks, okay? So I'm going to activate the growth ability for the Deep Vent. When you activate the growth ability for Deep Vent, you always add 2 Archaea to the Deep Vent. That's how that works. The trigger ability of the Deep Vent is to simply just take all of the Archaea from the Deep Vent back into your personal supply. Now, obviously, what I did was I took 2 from my personal supply for the example. So what you would actually do is you would take 2 from this box here, from the general supply where everyone has access to. You would take 2 from there for growth, for the Deep Vent. And then on a future turn, your next turn, you could trigger this ability, okay, and get those and add them to your supply, your personal supply, to protect yourself from future attacks, obviously. Now, the vampire squid doesn't have a growth ability. It has a passive growth ability, but it doesn't have a growth ability. So no effect. Nothing happens. So then you go here to the goblin shark. The goblin shark's ability, its growth ability, allows it to get 1 Archaon for each adjacent rock. Okay? Well, this one doesn't have a rock symbol on it. It has a bioluminescence and it has a predator. So it doesn't get an Archaon from this one. But the deep vent has this rock symbol. So you would put 1 Archaon on the goblin shark. That's how that would work. You couldn't activate its trigger until you had 3 on here. So obviously, you definitely will want to get more Archaon on here in the future for its trigger attack, obviously. Now, let's say the second turn comes along. Let's say, obviously this would actually technically be the second turn anyways, but let's just say this was the next turn. And let's take this one here, the anglerfish, and put it right here, like this. The anglerfish. Now we have 4 tiles there. And the anglerfish, its growth ability is going to allow you to add 1 Archaon for each adjacent bioluminescence. So in actuality, the best place to place this anglerfish would be up here, actually above the deep vent. So that would be like the best position because there's 2 adjacent bioluminescence to it. And so you would activate the growth's ability for the anglerfish. You would add 2 to it because there's 2 adjacent bioluminescence to it. And of course, I'm adding once again from my hand. So I would add 2 from the box, obviously. And then I would get to activate, or should I say, I'm going to trigger with the deep vent and add these 2 from the deep vent to my personal supply. Now, because the vampire squid is adjacent to the deep vent, and the deep vent just triggered, this passive growth ability now activates, and I get to add 1 Archaon from the general supply to the vampire squid. Now, the goblin shark here only gets 1 Archaon because there's only 1 rock adjacent to it, obviously. So that's kind of how that would all work. And then, obviously, there are other tiles here as well. So now, let's just say the giant tube worms were next. So let's say that's the case there, for instance. Okay, so then the anglerfish would get 2 more from the general supply. The growth, again, for the deep vent. Nothing happens to the vampire squid, obviously. Then the giant tube worm's ability would activate. And that one I have to look up. I haven't played with this one yet. So the growth ability for the giant tube worm is you add 1 Archaon for each adjacent heat and 1 for each adjacent rock. Okay, well, there's 2 adjacent rocks to the giant tube worms, and there's 1 adjacent heat. So you would add 3 Archaon from the personal supply to the giant tube worm. That's how that would work. Let's see here. Let's add another tile to the equation. Okay, so the next round we have this porous rock here. Let's put it right here. I think that would be smart. Porous rock. And porous rock is a pretty simple, easy little ability, which is pretty nice. Okay. So, the first one that would get activated here is actually the anglerfish. So the anglerfish would then trigger its ability. The anglerfish would take 3 Archaon off of it to attack the opponent. And they would lose 1 cube for every bioluminescence they had. Obviously, they only have 1 at the moment, but that's what would happen. If they would probably have more than that, more than likely. But because that effect triggered, the vampire squid would then get another Archaon as well. Then the porous rock's ability is to grow and add 1 Archaean to the porous rock. The deep vent would basically put these back into my hand. Obviously, this one would actually go here, and etc., etc. So now you kind of understand how it's going to work. You're going to trigger, you're going to grow. There's a lot of different abilities here for sure. And we're actually going to do a gameplay video explaining further how this game is going to work as we do a little gameplay video. I don't know if we'll play the full game, but we'll definitely play at least a few rounds. So you see you guys in the next video.